Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by Ella Massal, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, today we're looking into parenting stress, the misalignment of perceptions, and even the styles that can impact the communication between parents and teachers. Joining me today is Professor of Psychology at Swansea University. His research areas range from learning and behaviour, autism, special needs, as well as educational interventions, and a whole lot of other research areas. Dr. Phil Reid, thank you so much for joining me, Phil.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much again for joining us so early in the morning for you and taking the time out of your early morning. I can see the sun coming to light as well.
Yeah, I can see the sun coming to light straight into my eyes, which is so. If I'm looking disturbingly starey or squinty, it's nothing to do with me. It's the sun.
Okay, good. Well, I'll take the sun. I'll take the sun over the clouds any day. So as much sun as I can see. Now, we're talking about the research areas. There is a lot of different research areas that you find yourself going into. How did you start looking into psychology as a career path for you?
Initially, I was more of a biologist.
Okay.
And I was interested in the behaviour of freshwater invertebrates. And I think that I became more and more aware of the impact of the environment on the behaviour of all kind of living organisms. So changes in temperature, changes in chemical composition of water where these little bugs live, all affect their behaviours. And from there is a short step from thinking, well, if their environment affects the way they behave, then presumably vertebrates are affected in the same way. And you begin to get drawn into areas of psychology which are about how we adapt to the situations, the context, the environments that we find ourselves in. And what are the mechanisms that allow us to adapt to a changing environment? So I think from there I started looking at learning and adaptive behaviour. And from there, really started applying that to a whole range of human behaviour.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great sort of aspect to dive into, looking at behavior and sort of changing how going from biology to psychology, and how have you found it to be very similar in terms of the motion, in terms of the behaviors that sort of take place?
Yeah, I think that the general principles are the same.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at how you relate changes in the environment. And I mean that in a broad context, not in the kind of environmentalist way that we tend to use that word now, but the broad situations in which people find themselves, the ways in which you study how those external changes in situation affect our behaviours and thoughts are pretty much the same across all disciplines. We just have a much broader range of behaviours we study in psychology than tends to be studied in other subjects.
Mm-hmm. So today we're talking about parent and teacher communication and how that sort of takes place. What are some of the most common mistakes either parents or teachers make when it comes to communication that you found?
I don't know if it's a mistake. And it's something that we all do. And that's we tend to know very well the things that we know very well. And that sounds like a truism, but it has a great impact on the way in which we talk to other people. So if a parent knows their child, then it's absolutely true that the parent knows their child best in the particular context that they're familiar with. So often the parent will spend more time with the child than anybody else, and that's generally true. They tend to know that child, however, in the context of themselves and in the context of things they do as a family. They then take that perception of the child and their knowledge, and they assume that that's what everybody else is going to know. And when they talk to teachers, they talk to other people, they're talking purely from that perspective. And when the teachers sort of staring blankly at them think, this isn't the child that I know, because this very outgoing, confident child that's been described to me is not the quiet little thing that sits in the corner and never says a word in the classroom. And immediately there's a difference, there's a gap in perceptions that opens up between the parent and the teacher. And sometimes that can make getting a mutual understanding and a mutual communication very difficult. And it can be something as trivial as that starts putting a bit of a wedge between individuals. And that's one issue, that it's not necessarily a mistake. It's a very natural thing to do, but it's just remembering that we change, and this goes for children too, as a function of the environment that we're in. And when we're in a different environment, our behaviours become very different. We all know that. We all present ourselves in different ways. At work, at home, with colleagues, with friends, we all have slightly different ways of behaving, slightly different ways of acting. And that's true of children. So it's not surprising that a child at home can be very different to a child at school. And I think both the teacher and the parent have to realise that. And they have to find some kind of way of understanding that the other person sounds like they're talking about a different child, but they're not. It's just the context changed. So it's about, I think, understanding that children change in different environments. And then when somebody says, but your child doesn't behave like that, don't necessarily get overly defensive. Don't take that as a challenge. Don't take that as the other person saying, no, you're wrong. I know more about your child than you do. They're not saying that. At least they shouldn't be. They're talking from their perspective. And it's by trying to find that mutual understanding and sharing of information to give everybody a good and rounded view of that individual, the child, because they change. They're human. They have a huge range of behaviours they show, and they'll do so in different degrees, in different contexts. So don't take it as a challenge when a parent or a teacher says, no, that's not right. That's not how they are.
Yeah.
You're both probably right. That's not how they are with you, but it might be how they are with somebody else. It's trying to find that mutual understanding. If you don't have that, you can't talk.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I feel like we forget ourselves as adults the fact that we are very different depending on the group that we're hanging around, the people that we're surrounding ourselves with. We can be very, very quiet when it comes to our family, but very loud when it comes to our friends. And that's true of all people as well. So I think when it comes to kids, it's going to be very different depending on the situation and the home situation, the school situation that they find themselves in. So that's a great way of, I think, answering that question. And it's something that I don't think we realize that we do, either as parents or teachers. We don't really realize that we're sort of comparing and being a competition somehow?
Well, we adapt to the situation that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very different being a child amongst either an only child or a child amongst a few siblings,
Yeah.
um, as opposed to a child amongst maybe 20 or 30 others in a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And there are cultural differences here as well, depending on how child rearing practices occur. For some cultures, child rearing is a very private business, with most of the rearing going on within a closed family unit. For other cultures, the rearing occurs as part of a community. And I think from teachers' perspectives, they've got to understand those different differences as well between the kind of backgrounds that different children are going to come with, because that's going to affect the way that children behave. And it's going to affect perhaps the perceptions of the parents that you're talking to. So
Yeah.
all of these influences are tremendously important to try and get a handle on.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And thank you so much for that introduction. Before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know some of your interests and maybe some recommendations that we can all add to our lists of different recommendations throughout the show. To start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
I've got many, many favorite books. Again, it depends on the context that we're talking about. If we're
Okay.
talking about within a psychological context, um, then I really think it again, it depends what I'm interested in. Um,
Okay.
as a very challenging book, psychologically, one thing that is really interesting to read is Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which is a book by B.F. Skinner, which was written close on 50 years ago, and perhaps it is
Wow.
50 years ago now,
Mhm.
looking at the implications for our society and the way that we think of ourselves, of moving from a position that says we are all autonomous, self-determining beings to one that says we're products of our environment. And
Mhm.
that simple shift in perspective for Skinner has rather profound implications about the way in which we should think of people, we should think of basic human concepts like rights and freedom and dignity, and the way that we should consider those, to the way in which we should think about government. So it's a very broad-ranging
Yeah.
um, musing on his research up to that point. And it's a challenging book, and I'm not sure he gets it right,
Mhm.
but it's a very interesting and different perspective. And I think for people who want to get an insight in what it might be to shift the perspective to a more environmental one in which we are considering the effects of the environment on us,
Mhm.
that's a good place to start.
Okay.
As I say, I think some of the things are just wrong.
Mhm.
And remembering it is a book written 50 years ago
Yeah.
now, and
Yeah.
our perspectives change, but nevertheless still challenging.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. No, that sounds really interesting. I think that whole idea of the fact that it is 50 years ago really does sort of stick in a little bit, because it's like, okay, 50 years ago, the whole society was different. The whole idea of the whole reason people used to get married is different. The whole reason people used to work is very different. So now the whole idea of how society sort of is structured is going to be completely different. But it will be interesting to look into how it was 50 years ago.
it is, and I think it's interesting to read that alongside another of his books, which was written in 1948, which is
Okay.
called Walden 2, which is a utopian novel envisaging a time in the future when the environmental movement in psychology, behaviorism, has got to the position where it can develop a society, and looking at the ways in which that society might be governed. And although that book was now written nearly, shuddering to think, 80 years ago, some of the suggestions for child rearing and education and work are remarkably contemporary. So he's envisaging a time when work is done and shared and rewarded according to a societal need for that work, and people choose what work they want to do, depending on how it's rewarded. So if the managers of society need people to go out and dig a ditch, they will increase the reward for that behaviour that day. Whereas if people need people to go and teach others, they will increase the reward for that type of work. People choose the work that they do. Now, going back to 1948, this is a very peculiar idea.
Yes.
Forwarding to the 21st century, when we do tend to dip in and out of different, well, not me, obviously, I've done this job for forever, but many people now sort of dip in and out of different careers. It seems much more contemporary. Again, not all correct, I don't think, and some of it is, I think, perhaps has a slight paternalistic view, which doesn't sit well in the 21st century. We've got to remember it was written just after the Second World War. But nevertheless, extremely far-sighted and prescient. And I think it's interesting that people were thinking like that. I think it's very important for us not to assume that we are so different now than our forefathers. Some bits are, quite clearly. But the thoughts that we have now about parenting, about how to raise families, about how to organise our society so that families can flourish, are thoughts that people have always had. And trying to find those problems, going back to my favourite non-fiction author, was Jane Austen, which it is all about relationships. It's 1830, 19th century rom-com sort of way of expressing relationships. And the constraints of our environment, society, that places on relationships, and although not necessarily an issue for Jane Austen, for many people at the time, things like parenting. The problems have always been, how do we parent, how do we have relationships in the society that we've got?
That's very true.
That's been with us forever. So we talk about things in the past. It's the same problems.
No, that's very true. And speaking of parenting, I know that everyone has a very different definition of what parenting is and how people sort of go ahead being a parent. In your either professional opinion, what do you think parenting could be defined as to you?
Whatever I say to this is going to anger somebody, so I apologise for that to begin with. I think it's about creating an environment in which the child is free to develop the productive behaviours in a safe way, and placing boundaries, safety nets around that child so that their potentially self-harming and destructive tendencies, which all children have because they don't know any better, don't damage them. So I think it's about, going back to that kind of Skinnerian environmentalist position, it's about managing the environment of the child so that they are free to express the behaviours that they need to express and that they find reinforcing, while managing in a non-aversive way the dangers for that child. So it's about that kind of providing that warmth, that nurturing, along with positive limit setting. So it's not about being permissive parents. That's perhaps as a parenting style, being overly permissive is as damaging as being overly authoritarian. They're both the extremes of a continuum. It's about authoritative parenting rather than authoritarian parenting. And that's about creating an environment which is open to receive the child's behaviours and is there to reinforce the behaviours that the child emits, while also managing that environment to be safe for the child. I know that sounds like a counsel of perfection, and I apologise for that. But I
No.
think that's what we're aiming for. So
Yeah.
it's not being overly permissive, and permissive parenting style is as damaging, if you think of that kind of 60s hippie, anything goes style. That style, I think, is as damaging as the uptight 50s parenting style that was a reaction against. Neither is ideal. You're not looking for an abrogation of responsibility. You're the adult. You know more than the child. You know what's dangerous. You know what limits to set. And it's setting those limits in a warm and productive manner, as opposed to a strict and restrictive manner.
I think that's a great definition, to be honest. I think that's such a very hands-on approach to parenting as well. I mean, I know permissive parenting, I've seen a lot of my friends sort of go through that conversation with me about their parenting style that they had when they were younger. And a lot of it was either authoritarian parenting style, was very extreme, not allowed to do anything, not allowed to have to be at home 24/7. But there was also that one that allowed them to be at home, allowed them to go out at whatever time of the night without really having strict guidelines as to, okay, you have to be home by 10 o'clock. And then it was such a great way to sort of compare which parenting style is better. And we definitely found that the middle is the best. As much as you can in the middle is probably the best, because one hated their parents in the end, and one really, I think, also didn't like their parents because there was no rules set on the child as well.
Yeah, children look for guidance. They need guidance. But as with anything, and think of this as in the workplace, if you're line managing somebody, sometimes you have to take decisions which you know they're not necessarily going to like, but you do your best to explain the reasons around those decisions, and then you stick with them. There's not that around some things which you know to be dangerous. There isn't scope for negotiation, but there's explanation that goes with it. And that's, I think, what I mean by positive limit setting. It's not just saying, you will not do this. you are in effect saying you will not do this, but you're saying, perhaps phrasing it, it's you don't want to do this because, and then give your reasons. And again, we're focusing on the negatives there, and that's perhaps a smaller part of it. Although I know there's a huge amount of fear around, especially now with parenting, and perhaps quite rightly so, that the parents are even more aware of the dangers than perhaps my parents were and your parents were. Back a few years ago, those dangers are signalled to us all of the time by media, social media, and parents get very, very worried and quite rightly want to keep their children safe. So there are things around that more restrictive end of parenting which are necessary. But I think there's still the minority of jobs that need to be done. Most of it is trying to manage that environment so that the child can flourish, that has those opportunities. So while we always end up talking about how do you keep the children safe, and that's a very important discussion, I think it mainly only about 20-25% of what a parent does.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot, and especially there's a lot of stress that parents feel throughout it as well, throughout the worry about their children's safety, worry about the children's grades, worry about all these different areas of this as the child gets older, whether the child isn't applying themselves too well. I'm also wondering, how does that stress, a lot of the parenting stress that sort of comes along, how does that impact the dynamic between a parent and a teacher?
Yeah, parenting stress is one of the major problems for parenting. When a parent starts to feel stress about their parenting,
Hmm.
then it's like any other stress. That has an impact, and it has multiple impacts. Firstly, it impacts the parent's own ability to parent. Um, when you're stressed, the first thing that goes is your ability to limit set for your child. So the classic example of a parent comes home and their child says, "I want a rabbit." Now, children are really good at this. They can keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Now, you've got to ask yourself as an adult, how long can I withstand the question, "Can I have a rabbit?" Is
Hmm.
it 3 repetitions? Is it 10? Is it 30? Is it 98? At what point do you give up and give in?
Hmm.
Now, if you're not stressed, usually people can hold out for quite a long time, um, and probably can hold out in a good humoured way until the child gets tired and forgets it, and that's great. But now consider you've had an absolutely awful day at work. You've had a row with your boss. The work that you've done, you've lost on the computer. Your bus or your train didn't turn up. You're soaking wet. You've just realised you've not gone to the shops. All of this stress is piling up. And then the child says, "Can I have a rabbit?" This
No.
is one thing too many.
Mhm.
And most parents at that point will just say, "Okay, overload. I've got to stop something. I've got to get through this." Just say yes. It'll go away.
Mhm.
Limit setting is one of the first things to go. As soon as the limit setting goes, then that child's behaviour starts to change. And the child's behaviour starts to become more challenging because they're going to test the boundaries. They're going to push.
Yeah.
Um, And as soon as you get a little bit of an opening there, they're going to start pulling that apart a little bit more. And you get this spiral starting to happen. And that's going to add to the parenting stress. So the limit setting goes a bit more. And you get this cascade. So that's what's happening with parenting stress with the child. As a consequence, that parent becomes very, very sensitive to any kind of challenge, any kind of unexpected or out of the ordinary event in their environment. They become hypersensitized, and they tend to become a little bit overreactive to things. So when a teacher starts talking to a parent about their child in school, the teacher may be well-meaning, but again has their own stresses and may not necessarily express themselves in as appropriate a way as they might when talking about the child. Because the parent is already sensitized to challenge, any slight perceived challenge is going to be multiplied in that stressed out parent. And they're going to overreact to the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So again, you have a misperception of communication going on because the parent being overstressed is overreacting to a perceived criticism. The teacher, perhaps they're stressed themselves, and let's not kid ourselves that our teachers have a cushy number. They've got an incredibly stressful job. They perhaps may be a little bit stressed. They perhaps are not as sensitive to the parents' needs as they might be. And again, you get this rather miscommunication where what should be a relatively easy conversation, because of the misperceptions, because of the oversensitivities, which are generated from a very stressful situation, very rapidly escalate out of control. And I think a lot of the parent-teacher severe problems that we see are really a result of both parties misperceiving and failing to understand the position of the other. And again, this is a counsel of perfection because we're all human, we all get stressed. And this is going to happen to us all. We all have bad days. But it's about trying to step back. The other thing that I think is difficult these days, that perhaps wasn't so difficult certainly 10, 15 years ago, is people's ability to filter. That's I think a product of too much interaction via social media.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think, especially when it comes to social media, we're all so focused on the idea of, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like as well. We're so focused on, okay, especially for parents, like there's this whole side of social media where it's just the perfect parent, or baking things from scratch, or, making mac and cheese, but making it homemade mac and cheese. And it's like, okay, you see a mom at home who's dealing with 3 kids at the same time, and she's making the microwave mac and cheese because that's the only thing that she can cook today. It's the only thing that she feels. And then she watches that and feels bad at the fact that she's maybe only able to afford that mac and cheese, but also only have that time because she's got 3 or 4 different projects that she has to handle at the same time. And it's that idea of the parenting, the perfect parent or the ideal parent kind of thing that, you know, not only a parent's going to see it, but the children are going to see that as well and be like, okay, mom, can you do this? Mom, can you? I know that when I was younger, I had this whole cookbook that I absolutely loved. It was designed by this mom who does things with the kids. And I was like, okay, can we do once every single week? Can we try to do one of them each time? None of my parents had time for that. I mean, my parents were still busy doing their own thing. Both of them were working at some timeline. And there's that idea of, okay, add on to that the fact that I want to do something with them, that they'll also feel guilty for not being able to have the time to do that. So we all get sort of stumped up. So when that comes the parenting stress, that's why when I'm hearing that, my mind's always just like, I'm not surprised you're stressed. I'd be stressed just listening to you complain about the different parenting expectations that we're sort of set in. Not just like when I'm talking about parenting, I think not just talking about being a mother or being the woman, but also being the father, sort of the idea of the stereotypical father responsibilities, stereotypical mother responsibilities. And if none of them are sort of filling that, then that's going to seem inadequate enough as being a family.
Yeah, we're entering a world which is very, very different.
Mhm.
Now, you're quite right. Social media presents a highly polished, positive face to the world. Everybody presents their best self on social
Yeah.
media. Nobody goes on social media and says, "Oh, bad day. The washing machine leaked. The cat was sick in the kitchen. This went wrong. That went wrong." Nobody puts those things up unless they're looking for huge amounts of sympathy. Usually it's, "Look at this tray of muffins I have baked while taking the car in for a service and just knocking up some ballet costumes for my 6 children who are." um, that's the face that people present.
Hmm.
And I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, as long as we all understand the game. That
Yeah.
this isn't real. This is like a TV show. This is like a movie. This isn't real. This isn't real life. And if
Hmm.
somebody wants to do that and to celebrate their one day of achievement, which is great, we should all be so lucky to get one day of achievement, then that's great for them. But it's not real life. And I think we need to recognize, don't get sucked in to that whole social media expectation thing. It's not real. You have one job as a parent, and that's to get through the day, and to help your children as best you can. And however you do that, that's fine. So you're right. There's those pressures which add to what people think they should be doing. There's also another side of social media which has changed the way that people communicate. People tend to be less filtered on social media.
Mhm.
They say things that they would never say in real life, often quite inappropriately
Mhm.
on
Very
social
true.
media.
Yeah.
Um, and that starts to leak into real conversations. And I make no excuses about saying that social media is not real world. It's a very different form of communication. It's nothing to do with your real life. People communicate differently. If you start adopting those very, sometimes strident, very opinionated, ways of communicating that people adopt on social media in real life, then you're going to come a cropper. You're going to run into problems, because that's not how to communicate with people.
Yeah.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we're so focused on the fact that, okay, I'm going to reply to a comment, or I'm going to comment something about how I feel about the fact that I don't like this video. Or I think I recently saw one where it was a teacher sort of getting ready for the week and the prep work that they did, and she was filling up the different drawers of like snacks just in case her kids get hungry. And then the comment was, "Are there nuts in that snack?" And I was like, of course, it's a nut bar. One, of course it has nuts in them. Two, do you really think that she would be stupid enough to hand a kid a nut snack if they're allergic to nuts? So it's that idea of, we're so judgmental of only knowing 15 seconds of a clip, of only seeing 50 seconds into someone else's life, and we're easily commenting on 2 seconds that they show, because we think that that's the 2 seconds that's going to change someone's life. And we're so able to have an opinion, but we don't recognize the fact that, okay, we're able to have one, but should we have an opinion? That's the real question.
Yeah, we're entitled to an opinion when you may not be entitled to express it. Is
Exactly.
the key thing there, and we don't have to say everything that we feel at the time that we feel it. And I think when we're communicating as parents or as teachers, that there's an issue here. We talk about emotional regulation a great deal. Now, when people usually use those terms, you need to have better emotional regulation. Often what we mean is somehow there's something wrong with having an emotion. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that it's necessarily wrong to feel the emotion. I think where we're beginning to have problems is finding the language by which to express that emotion. So if we're feeling sad, or if we're feeling angry, or if we're feeling frustrated or happy, those are the feelings we have, and that's how we feel. And you shouldn't be judged for that. But there's a difference between feeling it and finding an appropriate way to express it. And in some ways, if we look at, say, people from the neurodiverse community, people with autism spectrum disorder, for a long time, people used to think, oh, these individuals have difficulty with emotion. Well, that's not really true. The difficulty that people with ASD sometimes have is not knowing they've got an emotion, very well aware of that, or knowing somebody else is having an emotion. They're usually very well aware of that. It's sometimes mapping the appropriate social communication around that emotion. And that goes for the neurotypical population as well. And I think what we're seeing with social media and a culture that places, prime importance on people's ability to express what they want when they want it, otherwise they're being oppressed in some, is we forget that we do have a responsibility to other people. And there's nothing wrong with being angry. There's nothing wrong with being joyous. It depends on how we express that. And I think if I do have a concern about modern life, and it's very easy to have concerns about modern life, it's that we need to be careful we don't lose our ability to to use language to express what we feel appropriately. We don't have to express anger or joy unfiltered, because
Yep.
that's scary. That we don't want to see that. I don't want to see an angry
No.
parent in front of
No.
me.
No, I think it's also that idea of sometimes we have to know when to not say anything. I think is the biggest thing as well. Like it's very difficult. You can have all the freedom to say whatever you want to say, but make sure that you say it in a way that is one, respectful. I think especially when it comes to parent and teacher communication, that's one thing that I've really learned as well is what a teacher would say to a parent. Like, for example, parent teacher interviews, when we're going and sitting down and you're talking about your child. There was one year, I think I did a parent teacher interview with one of my teachers. And his first reaction was, I don't think Dina is going to go anywhere because she's just going to be a C student for the most of her school life. She said that to a parent, for one. And then he also said it to a parent with her child sitting next to her. So I was sitting next to my mom. And it was that idea of, okay, but how is that encouraging as a teacher in a way that's allowing a parent to say, okay, yes, she's struggling at the moment, but doesn't mean that she's going to be struggling for the rest of her life.
Yeah, you're quite right in that as professionals, teachers, and just as parents, need to find appropriate ways of expressing what they need to express. And one, there's an issue about whether that needs to be expressed. Is it really an issue that this or that child is performing at such and such a level at this particular time? Is that really an issue that needs to be talked about? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it is, then it's about what's the purpose. And again, behavioral psychology is all about what's the function of this. So why is this behavior being emitted? What goal is it aimed at? What's it achieving? Now to say, okay, I'm afraid, Mr. and Mrs. X, that your child is just sick. What's that actually achieving? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Is it really important?
Yeah.
Now, from a teacher's perspective, if they're solely focused on grades, then maybe it is. But that's their perspective. And I think here again, we have to look at the organisation of how we run our schools, how our schools are funded, how our schools are judged. If our schools are judged on the basis of their results, and we've got these league tables of this is a good school, this is a bad school, which is purely determined on the basis of examination results, then from the teacher's perspective, this is an important thing to know about. Because if this child falls short, then the school falls short and the funding disappears. That's what's driving that teacher's behaviour. But the parent doesn't care about that.
Yeah.
Child certainly doesn't care about that. This child who is academically not able couldn't care less, because that child may well know they want to go and do something not academic. That's their calling. And what do they care? So this is just no functionality whatsoever.
No, yeah.
For that
No,
child.
that's very true. And I think especially when it comes to the communication, like the idea of communicating in a way that the teacher can understand the parent can understand the teacher, also the child can understand what the teacher is saying. So it's using the language that I think is going to be professional, but also going to be a little bit more respectful of both sides and the stress that sort of both sides go through.
Yeah, it's very difficult because, especially when people are dealing with children, because the protective behaviours are manifest very, very strongly in
Yeah.
the parents. And especially if they're feeling stressed, as we've talked about, they're going to be very, very sensitive, very, very perhaps overreactive to any perceived challenge, any perceived threat to their child. And as professionals, teachers need to be aware of that. And they need to find the language which, for the most part, is non-threatening and non-challenging. I deliberately say for the most part, because I think there may be situations, perhaps few and far between, where you do need to perhaps provoke is too strong a word, but to initiate a conversation which otherwise wouldn't be had.
Yeah.
And again, it's about professional judgment. And it's sometimes I think you might get the feeling that this parent does need a bit of a wake-up call. I think I don't think that happens very, very often. But so again, this blanket rule doesn't really apply, and we need to be careful about that. But if for the general run of things, it's really about thinking why you want to tell a parent your child is failing. Failing at what? Why is that important? What's the goal here? It's and thinking through all of those things to get the most out of that conversation. Because what's the point of sitting down with a parent and having an argument for 5 minutes? Nothing was achieved.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Now, when it comes to practice and habits, and this is something that you do as yourself, what is a practice that you do to build on your communication?
That's a good challenging question. I would probably say that despite having spent the last 40 minutes spouting on about communication, I don't honestly reflect that much on my own communication style. Somewhat ironically, um, I I tend to try and modulate my communication style by doing it. So I will think by doing. So
Okay.
I'm not a person who spends a long time thinking very carefully through what it is that I have to do and doing it. I will do it, but while I'm doing, I try to be as mindful, to use a trendy term, uh, as aware of the effects of my behaviour as I possibly
Okay.
can. That doesn't always work. And I'm thinking of many times when I've just got off on a behaviour, with scant regard for its consequences, as we all do. But I think that I try to modulate as I'm doing, and I try to adapt my style in terms of communication based on the results that it's getting. And
Okay.
that sounds terribly psychopathic when I've just heard that replayed. Um,
No, not at all. No, I don't think so at all. I think it makes a ton of sense. I think it's good to, and I think we were talking about this before we were recording as well. I think it's good to sort of try to do it before you really analyze it and really look into it. I think I like the idea of doing things as you go along and thinking about it as you go along, because it makes it more of a tasks to try to figure out for example, as I start talking, I'm also trying to think about what I'm going to keep saying as I'm talking. And that makes it a little bit easier because it makes it a little bit more of a conversation instead of that awkward 5 seconds of silence while I think about what I'm going to say, then say it, which, I can say works in some situations and doesn't work in other situations as well. But I like the idea of not having to overthink it before you actually start it. For example, if you're building something like building a Lego car, for example, there's that idea of, okay, I follow the instructions, I just follow step by step and I build it. If you start putting together the pieces next to each other as you're building it, you're going to get so completely taken over by the fact of how many pieces there are. And you won't ever actually get it done because you'll be so busy doing a side quest instead of doing the main quest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head when you use the word conversation. Communication is a two-way process. You need at least one other in order to communicate. Otherwise, it's a bit weird because you're just talking to yourself, and we have psychological terms for that. But it's about a flow of ideas, and you only really know where you're going as part of a joint two-way flow of ideas. You can't ever control everything by sitting down beforehand and figuring it all out and then just performing the behaviors. There are very few situations in life where that works. And you have to have utter and complete control of your environment for that to happen. I'm thinking of Alfred Hitchcock as probably one of the few people who could do that because he had complete control over the film. It was storyboarded before he did it, and he just went in, did the shots as they were on the storyboard. That was the end of it. Life isn't like that.
No.
Because we don't have that level of control over our environment, and it would be excruciatingly dull if we did.
Yes.
Indeed, Hitchcock found it very, very dull once he got beyond the storyboard phase. It's about allowing a communication to develop, a conversation. And you can't do that with planning. You can do that in situ. And as you said, you can think as you do. That doesn't mean that we're allowed to say anything and everything that comes into our heads because we want to say it. That's not a meaning of a two-way conversation. It's about keeping both people on board, hearing what the other person is saying, and reacting appropriately to that. So in terms of my own practice, insofar as I have any, and I'm sort of, is it a practice? I suppose it is. It's a practice in the sense of what I do. It's not a thought out strategy. It's something that I allow to be shaped up as I'm doing it.
Well, it seems to be working for you.
You'll be a better judge of that than me. It's always the other person who can judge our own behaviour. It's like that old
That's very true.
Two behaviours meet each other in the street, and one says to the other, "You're doing great. How am I?" It's for other people to judge how we do.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think everyone else is going to be a better judge than like we said, we always say that we're our harshest critics. So we'll always put ourselves even deeper in than what we actually are. Now,
I say that's true also of parenting as well, going back to that notion of parenting stress and the notion of a perfect parent. There isn't one.
No.
That whatever you're doing, if your child is still breathing at the end of the day, then, sadly some children aren't, then you've done your best. And even if things go very, very badly wrong, then you've probably done your best, because you are not the sole determinant of your child's life. So there's you and there's a whole world. And even if things go terribly wrong, then it's not necessarily your fault.
No, that's very true statement. And that's a very great way to move on to the next area of the show, which is the open mic. Now, this gives you a chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about, or maybe an area that we didn't get to speak about throughout the show. So in the last minute or so, I'd love to give you the floor and share what's on your mind with us today.
I would say that as a psychologist and a behavioral psychologist, almost anything is incredibly interesting to me. So what we've talked about is very, very interesting. What I would encourage people to do is to explore some of these aspects of behavioral psychology a little bit more. When we talk about psychology, we think about traditional Freudian approaches and deeply analytic approaches, and that's great. I've got no problem whatsoever with that. But another aspect of our lives is that we are determined by the environment around us, and that's a major impact on our behaviors. This is not a get out of jail free card. This is not something that we can play to say, oh, it's not my responsibility. This is the environment which is doing it. This is nonsense just as much as the alternative position. But that environment does impact us. And I would just think of asking people to consider how they react to their environment, and to get them to think about, okay, my environment does impact me, but I'm part of my environment. In what ways can I act to make my environment better, so this better environment controls me and people around me in more productive ways? It's a two-way street. And when I say environment, I don't necessarily mean climate. I mean all of the things that are around us, all of those circumstances that we live in. How do we set our lives up in a way that might be more productive? And the easiest way to do that is do some very simple stuff around your own lives, and a bit of housekeeping in your life go a long way. What's really necessary and what isn't? That might help.
No, I think that's a great piece of advice to give, because I think we sort of get caught up in that idea of, are we doing it okay? Are we doing it all right? Is everything going okay? And we forget the fact that other people are going to know a little bit more. And without that self-reflection on ourselves, it's just where our minds are going to keep spinning as well. We're going to keep thinking and overthinking, and in the end, like, nothing's going to get done. And that's not going to be a great way to sort of go about it as well. And I really do think that that's the great piece of advice to give today.
We are products of our environment, but we're also agents of the environment as well.
Exactly.
We can change our environment, just as our environment changes us. And I think it's that when we say reflection, just don't reflect on yourself. Reflect on the way your life is and how you might be able to change it, if you need.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's a great piece of advice to end the show on, because that's a great last little giveaway for everyone to know and everyone to remember. Now, thank you so much, Phil, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing talking about this. And I know we got so wrapped up in the social media aspect, which I basically jumped up with joy, because me ranting about social media is always going to be my number one thing to rant about. Now, if our listeners want to find out a little bit more about you, is there a place that they're able to go to?
Well, I'm one of the few people who doesn't really have any social media presence. I don't possess a mobile phone. So I don't really have much of that. My university provides a web page for me. So
Okay.
if anyone really does want to know a bit more, then they could either go to my web page at Swansea University, or they could look at I suppose my work in Psychology Today. So you could look at that and see me ranting about social media and its effects on everyday life. Probably those are the easiest two places if people cared. Um,
Of
that's the one
course.
reason why they should. But that's two places they could go to if they wanted.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, I think social media is definitely where the conversation is nowadays when it terms of the long-term effects that social media has. So that's definitely a good place for everyone to start if you're wanting to know a little bit more about Phil and hear his rant about social media as well. Thank you again, Phil, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing talking to you.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your morning as well. And now that the sun is a little bit not in your face anymore, I think it'll be quite enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I think it's gone. That was it. That
Oh,
was the British springtime. We
yeah.
saw it and it's gone, and it's just misty and wet. Uh,
Well, it's the same here. So at least we're sharing the weather.
we are. Yeah.
Well, I hope you guys learned as much as I did, and I'll see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.